We live in a world reeling from multiple crises: ecological, political, economic, social. We call this the meta-crisis. But there's another one, what John Vervaeke has dubbed the meaning crisis, which I believe undergirds them all, providing this meta-crisis its fuel and its inertia. We live in a meaning crisis, a crisis of meaning at the collective level, which both exacerbates the causes of the meta-crisis while simultaneously keeping us from the kind of cohesive, purposeful vision we might summon to respond to it. Naive fundamentalist sureties and despairing nihilistic apathies everywhere thwart some genuine progress towards regaining our footing and flourishing. Both are direct consequences of the meaning crisis, representing either a reactionary retreat into the secure domain of traditionalism, or the unmoored fall into the abyss of postmodern relativism. Each, in their way, only adds fuel to the fire of a burning world. It's my conviction, then, that to solve the meta-crisis, we must first solve the meaning crisis. We must get ourselves right with purpose, if we're to survive an Anthropocene era. To use the language of systems analysis, we must find the leverage points for systems-level change. In a complex socio-political system, such an Archimedean point is to be found, I believe, in people's beliefs, their psychic orientations to reality, their foundational philosophies, and unspoken axioms about the world. An intervention at this fundamental level for individuals can have vast cascading effects on the larger system they inhabit. Thus, if we are to, as the metamodernists winkingly say, save the world, we will need to articulate a form of meaning that works again. We will need efficacious meaning to spread virally, mimetically propagating an organic bottom-up renewal. But, to do this, we must first reconstruct meaning after it's been so precipitously deconstructed. As it happens, this is the project I've been engaged in for the better part of a decade now. I had no choice. For me, it was personal. The meaning crisis is a cultural crisis. In fact, a civilization crisis. And yet, if it doesn't sound too strange to say, it's also something I've experienced directly. What I mean is this: collectively, our current societal confusion has come about as the result of the breakdown of effective meaning-making in both of the principal cultural codes we've historically used to make sense of the world. First, traditional religion succumbed to modernity's rationalism and empiricism. But then, the promised progress myth of modernity faltered, showing itself in need of radical revision. For me, this progressive disillusionment occurred at the individual level, within my own biography. A bit of a rare feat these days, actually, since not many will have had the opportunity to know all-out mythic traditionalism from the inside, even if only to lose it. It's rare, I say, because to maintain that level of pre-modern naivete these days, you've got to be so well cordoned off from the rest of the world, in a subculture dogmatically committed to maintaining its own worldview in spite of everything, with well-enforced blinders on and a fierce in-group, out-group dynamic. As it happens, that's exactly what conservative American evangelicalism has excelled at. It takes a background like that, or a similar bastion of pre-modern holdouts, be it Amish, ultra-Orthodox, what have you, to know, phenomenologically, what it's actually like to lose a naively held mythological cosmos. But such was the cosmos I was born into, and from which I've emigrated in search of a meaning that still works. What I'm about to say, then, comes from the vantage of one who's traversed a number of different cultural codes and experienced, directly, psychologically, their sequential dissolutions and disillusionments. In fact, the very idea that individual psychological development and cultural code progression can and do map onto one another was one thing that intuitively made sense to me about development stage models like integral theory, spiral dynamics, and Hansi's effective value memes. The cultural is personal. Having experienced this progression internally, at the individual level, offers some perspective, I think, on what's happening to society in general right now. When I look around me, I see this disillusionment sweeping generations of people, as well as the scared, reflexive recoil away from it. I see the breakdown of sense-making, nihilism, and apathy, as well as entrenchment in fundamentalisms. The proliferation of reactionary ideologies promising a return to an older, simpler way of life. And head-in-the-sand New Age woo boasting its own sort of naivete. In short, I see the same meaning crisis underway, but now writ large, and playing out at the cultural scale. A meaning crisis, in fact, only now reaching its apogee after unfolding over the course of centuries. And so I wondered, could the path that I found for personally getting myself out of vertigo and nihilism, beyond the temptations of reactionary solutions, and to a place of constructive spirituality be of use to the culture more broadly? For meaning is necessary, absolutely necessary, for human beings. If individuals lose a sense of meaning, the society they comprise will likewise unravel. This is, I believe, precisely what is happening. The death of God, long ago pronounced by Nietzsche, is finally being realized by the rest of us. The shadow of God has finally dimmed, and everywhere people are waking up to a world they don't know how to live in, how to make sense of, how to make meaningful. As an increasingly complex world has occasioned the collapse of both traditional religion and modernity, what Jamie Wheel calls meaning 1.0 and 2.0, respectively, it's absolutely vital that we get to reconstructing a new working spiritual framework for human society, what Wheel calls meaning 3.0, and what I'm thinking of is metamodern spirituality. Broadly speaking, that's the goal. To achieve it, we'll need to answer a dauntingly difficult question. How do we preserve that pure, immediate, inspirational, and motivational sense of meaning that humans once found through traditional mythology, without losing or otherwise abandoning the gains of critical, reflective thought, provided so well by modern and postmodern interrogation? This seems to me to be of the utmost importance, because getting this equation wrong has occasioned so much of the sense-making and meaning-making breakdown we see proliferating all around us, and which continues to threaten the very continuance of human civilization on this planet. By getting it right, however, it's possible, I think, to reclaim a sense of meaning that works in this prehistoric hardware, while maintaining the kind of complexity of thought and awareness we'll need to navigate an increasingly complex future. It's been my effort, born of direct struggle with the insights of the successive cultural codes, traditional, modern, postmodern, to find my way to a meaning that still stands after so much critical reflection, and stands tall. To find a meaning as psychologically fulfilling as traditionalist mythology, as accurate and dependable as modern science, and as social contextually aware as postmodern critique. Such a paradigm strikes me as the natural end of a distinctly metamodern spirituality, a framework for exploring our ultimate concerns as humans in a new religious imaginary at home in the 21st century. To get there, though, requires making some hard-won developmental gains, at both the individual and collective levels. It requires authentically learning and integrating the key insights of the various cultural codes, and navigating their successive layers towards a broader, more holistic vision. Such development, however, is inherently difficult, because to do so means intentionally pursuing and embracing a direct assault on whatever your current paradigm is. It means willfully subjecting your most cherished preconceptions and existential axioms to a thoroughgoing scrutiny. It means a voluntary sacrifice of your sacred cows on the altar of personal growth. It means coming to recognize the degree to which what you take to be absolute is actually only partial, and what you thought was ultimate reality was actually an illusion. And one of the reasons I think this has been so hard to achieve in the domain of spirituality, and that's why religion and spirituality have remained so regressive for so long, is because the process of disillusionment required for such growth is not itself recognized as a spiritual practice. To the traditionalist, to become disillusioned is to lose the faith, to backslide, to turn apostate, become an unbeliever. It's perceived as the very negation of religion, not its salutary path or development towards a higher stage. Those pushing the disillusionment narratives from the other side seem only too eager to confirm this fear. The secularization theory in general, and the new atheists in particular, pronounce loudly and unflinchingly the notion that spirituality itself is simply a childish superstition whose days are numbered. To become disenchanted is simply to grow up, and thus wake up to the hard truths of reality, which is to say, godless materialism, period. Full stop. Goodbye, God. Hello, unguided and mechanistic universe. Now, this framing, presumed by theists and atheists alike, ultimately proves counterproductive, I think. Understandably wary of such prospects, disillusionment from the standpoint of tradition becomes simply the devil's work. To abandon the inherited myth as given is, it would seem, to abandon any possibility of God, spirit, or religious community. Looking around at the growing nihilism and advancing meaning crisis, it's not hard to see why many take a hard pass on that ticket to apparent nowhere. What I'm arguing here is different. Yes, disillusionment is necessary. Not to lose your spirituality, but to deepen it, strengthen it, refine it. Proper disillusionment does not ineluctably entail the destruction of religion, but rather its development, its maturation, its improvement. If traditionalists could hear this and believe it, perhaps more would embark on the difficult but deeply rewarding spiritual path out of naive literalism, confident in knowing that it is not to destroy your God that I say these things, but to better reveal God, to remove some of the veils that we may better know spirit, less as we have imposed upon it and more as it is, or might be. Still, disillusionment it is. To advance in our understanding of God and spirituality, we will first need to destroy some idols, especially what Jean-Luc Marion calls conceptual idols. As our civilization has progressed through the various cultural codes, people all over have had to endure the disillusionments that occur between codes, between worlds. Because this process doesn't happen uniformly, it's important to appreciate that multiple cultural codes will be coexisting simultaneously within society at any given time. Perhaps you personally resonate with the talk of metamodernity you've been hearing and feel it matches your own cultural sensibility. You still probably know many people you consider postmodern, a good number of modern, and maybe not a few traditionalists. All are out there, right now. So let's start with the traditionalists. The religious world I inhabited as a child and adolescent was, for good and ill, richly enchanted. You talked to God, and He listened. Many even said He spoke to them directly. God was the purpose and end of everything, the creator of the world, and the one who would bring about its end and healing transformation. Now, not everyone believed in God. In fact, most of the world had apparently missed that boat. People were generally fallen and given over to evil, misled by the devil himself and his legions of demonic forces, in a millennia-old struggle with celestial powers. Some people were so lost, in fact, that they'd actually become possessed by demons themselves. The best protection against all of that was to know and cherish God's unique revelation, which He had spoken directly to human beings in the past, who then wrote it all down. The Bible contained it all, and in it one could find the clear answers to all of life's challenges, since every last word of it was inspired and without error, written down with pristine accuracy by Moses himself, or by inspired prophets like Isaiah and Daniel, who were so touched by God, in fact, they had even been able to intuit the future. As for the stories about Jesus, they were written down by eyewitnesses, making first-rate historical accounts of the most amazing events to ever transpire on earth. Miraculous events, where the power of God could change water to wine, or exorcise those demons from the possessed, or even cause a person to come back to life after dying. True, things like that didn't happen much anymore, which could be cause for doubt. But that was why we needed faith, and to hold fast to it no matter what. To not let the devil tempt you away from the truth and lead you to disbelief, because if you became an unbeliever and died that way, you'd go to hell, where you'd burn in torment for all of eternity for turning your back on the one true Savior. Amen. I literally believed that. I believed it. Literally. I believed it so strongly, in fact, and took to heart so intensely the existential import of it all that I was ready to devote my entire productive life to it. If the Bible contained the ultimate truth, I wanted to know that thing in and out and upside down. Who was Hezekiah, Josiah, or Zephaniah? What was their world like? What were their enigmatic texts about? What did it all mean? So I started studying it. I spent years learning Greek and Hebrew, and threw myself into the field of biblical studies with a fervent interest to learn the history and context of it all in the greatest depth. As I said, though, this personal story of mine is actually just a miniature version of a much bigger tale, the story of Western culture itself. I was just late to the game, an oblivious traditionalist holdout in what had long already become a very modern world. A bit like Brendan Fraser's character, actually, from that 90s movie, Blast from the Past. I wasn't the first person to turn my zealous interest to studying the Bible. It didn't take long after the scientific revolution, in fact, and the dawn of modernity, for people to turn scrupulous observation and analysis to holy scriptures. People had been applying their acute attention and meticulous observation in this way to make astonishing historical insights about holy texts since the 1700s. Gradually, they noted inconsistencies, leading to the recognition of different source materials, leading to entirely new theories about authorship and compositional history than those of tradition. With fastidious skill and argumentation, they could eventually prove that texts were written far later than originally thought, that the authors weren't the people they were claiming to be, that different sources told different tales, that different narratives contradicted one another in glaring ways, and none of them were written by eyewitnesses. They showed, for instance, that the biblical texts weren't so unique after all. There were countless other gospels and apocalypses that most people just never heard of simply because they weren't canonized. They could trace the invention and evolution of what had been presumed to be the timeless theological absolutes, the character and nature of God, and even the existence of the devil himself. By the 1800s, the story one walked away with was messy, historical, evolutionary, imprecise, and imperfect, and a million miles from the neat, tidy truth of the fundamentalism I'd known. That old story was, from this new vantage of knowledge, actually absurdly naive, quaint, and mythological. From the standpoint of modernity, the traditional appears like so much silly superstition and fairy tales. The modern is disillusioned of tradition's illusions. My experience, like that of the West more generally, has been the disillusionment of traditional Christianity. But what I'm saying here applies just as well to any of the other traditional religions. Jesus didn't turn water into wine, but neither did the Buddha leap out of his mother's womb and proclaim he would achieve enlightenment. Muhammad didn't fly through the air on a winged horse, and Moses didn't part the Red Sea in two. All the great world traditions arose before modernity, and so all assume a pre-modern worldview in their articulation of absolute truth. It took the development of modern thinking to even differentiate ideas like natural, supernatural, or historical fact and poetic truth. Subjective and objective worlds were more blurred, and religion itself wasn't even a category until there were multiple religions to even compare. The upshot of all this, of course, is that people today will be incredibly confused and mistaken if they hold religious stories as instances of literal historical fact. This is both a misinterpretation and an anachronism. It is, however, the pitfall of all traditionalism, at least as it's come to coexist simultaneous to and interacting with the modern cultural code. Conservative American evangelicalism is very much an instance of the traditional cultural code operating in today's world. So is every fundamentalism. I was born into it, but others adopt it willingly, enthusiastically. To moderns, this may seem bewildering, but it shouldn't. The traditional cultural code much better reflects the kinds of belief proclivities and behaviors human beings have hardwired into our nature. Modern rationality and empiricism took millennia to come online. Traditionalism was what we lived in for the thousands of years before that. It just comes more naturally to us. The psyche, before having it trained out of it, is a world of myth and absolutes, of narrative meaning and human-sized stories. It's an enchanted world, full of meaning and symbol. It's a world in which supernatural forces can and do influence human affairs. It's a world where bodies have souls, and souls are eternal. With so clean and rosy a picture as that is one's basis, the modern narrative may seem bleak, dull, dark by comparison. An incomprehensibly vast, unguided universe of infinite space. Everything just atoms in a void. The emergence of life a fluke. Its evolution an unseemly narrative of eat or be eaten. Human suffering without justification, and death the ultimate end. Now, if you've never known the confidence and surety of traditionalism, perhaps this sounds like an overblown caricature. It isn't. To those who've only known modernism and postmodernism, the most naive and idealistic thing they can envision is modernity, with its utopian ideals and efforts in this world. But imagine literally believing you yourself will be taken up into heaven to live forever in the eternal presence of God, in the true world beyond. No earthly utopia can match that kind of transcendental idealism. Nor can you comprehend the sense of isolation and loneliness felt when you accept that it doesn't exist. To think that no one is looking down on you, watching out for you. Having lost this mythological sense of the world, I get it. Losing the traditional world is hard. And at first, it really, really sucks. Welcome to Disillusionment. Disillusionment is an incredibly disturbing process, so let's talk about what it really means. Becoming existentially disillusioned means nothing less than the collapse of your world as you know it. The pillars holding it up fallen down, the fixed center crumbles, and everything loses its relative meaning. Your world, your cosmos, falls apart. Such is the nature of a meaning crisis, and they are of existential importance. Existential, not just in the philosophical sense, but existential as in a matter of life and death. A crisis of meaning is a dangerous thing. A religious world is like a bubble containing your oxygen on an inhospitable planet. If the bubble bursts, you're naked before the elements. A religious world is an oasis of order carved out of a desert of chaos. A life lived outside of meaning is a fragile and precarious one. This, it seems, is a universal human trait. The affliction of meaninglessness or the breakdown of one's meaning-giving framework has always been made by the mind a matter of life and death. Today, for instance, we are seeing record levels of suicide in the developed world as more and more people enter a disillusioned modern world and find it inhospitable to their tradition-shaped psyche. Scores of people, it turns out, would rather not exist at all than live in an existential malaise, in a nihilistic void. And the same psychological principles are at work today in all of us. We all have the same prehistoric hardware. So when your meaning breaks down, your basis of value crumbles. Without values, you can have no motivation, no drive to act, and no ability to do one thing versus another. You become paralyzed, apathetic. Everything is pointless. You have, in short, a meaning crisis. Who cares if the world burns? Who cares if the environment goes to shit or people in your town are living in poverty? Why care about anything? Caring is for suckers. Meaning, value, all an illusion. That's what happens when you lose your central pillar. You've lost your sense of the absolute, and now things exist in radical relativity to one another. You can see now that what you thought was absolute reality was in fact but a contingent world. In this way, you gain a vantage on your old world, as if looking down on it from above. Your world has been relativized, and the experience then is one of vertigo, a vertigo of nihilism. You're swimming in the unordered realm, the unexplored territory of chaos, without a center, and thus without a basis of value. All that you knew to be valued you now recognize as partial and parochial. Now, hard as it may seem, though, this is the path of spiritual growth. To see more of the truth, we must first clear the slate of preconceptions, of misconceptions. To find God, one must first lose God. And this feels like despair, like falling into the abyss and losing everything of value. But take heart, all isn't lost. And by the end, you'll have gained more than what you parted with. What comes back will be refined and more purified of illusion, because what you lost was never going to serve you anyway. It never really had. During your deconstruction, though, it's best not to think of such things at all, but simply to follow the process where it leads you. You can't skip the dark night, or you'll also skip the dawn. You must simply do your best to integrate in all earnestness the truths you find in the course of your disillusionment. These need to solidify before anything else. As I say, such is the path of spiritual growth. However, this is also the path between the cultural codes. Modernity and postmodernity each offer their own forms of disillusionment and insight. With each break, we lose the surety of the past. But if we can survive the interim chaos, we can land on higher ground with better vantage to take in more of reality. Any metamodern spirituality worth its salt must take the lessons of modernity and postmodernity to heart before attempting to move beyond them. Religion arose in the traditional world, in the traditional cultural code. The world, however, has changed. Religion will need an update if it's to survive, and we need it to survive. As the meaning crisis has shown us, something like religion and spirituality must persist if we, as a species, are to survive. The question we must answer then is, as I said at the outset, how do we preserve that pure, immediate, inspirational, and motivational sense of meaning that humans once found through traditional mythology, without losing or otherwise abandoning the gains of critical, reflective thought provided so well by modern and postmodern interrogation? Like Aeneas loading up his hearth gods and sailing off into the uncharted waters, we'll need to salvage meaning from the rubble of the traditional world and learn to inhabit some different island worlds before we can find our destination and build anew. So let's get disillusioned, shall we? The realizations and insights of modernity are real and powerful. Reason and evidence are formidable tools for drawing closer to ultimate reality and avoiding a dysfunctional relationship to the world. The transcendent idealism of traditional religion, of this world and the world beyond, here falls apart. There is, science shows us, actually just one world, this one, the world of matter and energy. A heaven of angels may not lie above us, but the heavens revealed by science are certainly not without their sublimity, their wonder, their awe-inducing vastness and majesty. True, we looked and saw no heavenly Father in our telescope, but we did see light years of space-time exploding with diaphanous shades and colors and supernova splendor. We lost the geocentric crystal spheres with their governing angels, but gained a sprawling supercluster within a filamental web of galaxies spanning out to the edge of space and back to the dawn of time. We lost our craftsman deity in the garden, shaping a first man out of dirt, but gained a connection with all life, a web of continual metamorphosis, from tree to tortoise to toenail, connected, tapestried together through eons of molecular gizmos weaving strands of helical code, tying us back to the plucky bacterium and Pangea. We lost an anthropomorphic creator god, making animals like a potter, but gained an all-pervasive, incomprehensibly complex co-creating force, shaping matter through iteration and incident into higher complex forms through epochs of ages, weaving life out of matter and sentience out of life, to the point that brains take stock of their own being and stand in awe of the billions of unfolding moments leading to this moment's fathoming. We lost miracles, yes, but gained all of existence as a miracle. There may be no walking on water or turning it to wine, but we can marvel at its chemical structure, how it sustains life, how its latent geometry produces crystalline stars of bewildering beauty, all different. How it falls from the sky to irrigate vegetation and rises again through evaporation in a cyclical dance that ties the continents together. These things are not the fine-tuned plan of an intelligent designer, no, but the emergent patterns and evolved symbiotic puzzle of innumerable variables co-adapting through eons of interaction and interest. This is a miracle. Existence itself, boring old mundane reality, is miraculous. It is so by the laws that govern its self-organizing, not in their breaking. Through modernity, we lost a small story. We gained an even bigger one. Through modernity, we lost certainty, but gained a deeper appreciation for the mystery of the universe. We lost the other world, but gained a new appreciation for this one, the world that holds all our inner worlds and always has. This planet isn't something to escape from come some final trumpet, a thing we can trash until a new earth descends out of heaven, returned to Edenic purity by divine magic. No, this earth, this one, is our only earth, and we are the only ones that can and must transform it into Eden, if ever. So long as we ignore what must be done here and now by us in favor of future salvation to some far-off shore, we'll fail to meet the challenges that press upon the world today. Seeking salvation, we damn the earth. We must grow up and reattune ourselves to where we live. We must regain a sense of earth, this world, as precious. Science is not the enemy of religion, but the revealer of a greater reality which our religion had been too small and too limited to consider. That doesn't sound so bad, does it? Well, don't get too comfortable just yet. There's a bit more deconstructing we have to do first. Modernity taught us a lot, but it too was only partial. It, too, had its blind spots and excesses, and so, in like manner, the realizations and insights of postmodernity have also been real and powerful. Learning to contextualize truth claims and become aware of your own blind spots is vital to wisdom. Not mistaking the partial for the absolute is necessary for true worship. To worship what's contingent as the absolute is idolatry. In seeking the absolute, then, you must first relativize everything. God is not a bearded white man. The very presumptions in such a representation are damaging to the very concept of God. I say it again, God is not a bearded white man. God is not bearded, nor white, nor man. To think these ideas are significant somehow to the concept of God is to reveal the degree to which you are confusing the contingent with the absolute. And yet, the so-called God of the philosophers, the causa sui, being itself, neither are these the absolute. Nor should we so hubristically presume that the discoveries of science provide us with the absolute final word. Dogma comes in many shapes, but the zeal to defend it, either as inspired word or consensus model, reveals a prideful disregard for what may lie outside our ken, and the possibility that we may indeed still have so many blind spots yet to discover. The apophatic mystics were, you could say, the first true postmodernists, but they were even more radical. For them, everything was contingent, theologically speaking. Not even conceptions like ultimate being, truth, goodness, or love could properly language the finally mysterious absolute. Thus, the only way to speak in anything close to accuracy about God is through negation. God is not mortal. God is not limited. And yes, to say it once more, God is not a bearded white man. To speak negatively about God is thus more true than to speak positively about God. It's no accident, then, that the apophatic mysticism has seen a resurgence of interest in postmodern theology. Try this one on for size. God is not existent. God does not exist. Sound like atheism? Actually, that's just theology speaking accurately for once. If God is above being, beyond being, of course God doesn't exist. God does not exist. Finally something pious theists and critical atheists can both agree on. Indeed, perhaps they always have, albeit by their own logics. Language was what confused them. And look at that, the linguistic turn. Language, forever incapable of truly expressing the signified. Correct, postmoderns, take it to heart. God is ineffable. Words fail. And so, as Wittgenstein intuited, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. The Tao you can speak is not the eternal Tao. Postmodern insight returns to us as ancient wisdom. What then is God? This God we talk about, this God we hold in our heads as a term for an idea we can't possibly wrap our heads around? You guessed it, a social construct. Say it with me. My conception of God is a social construct. Now we're getting somewhere. These are some of the insights of modernity and postmodernity, and they're crucial, important, and valid. Whatever metamodern spirituality is, then, it must embrace these insights, not run from them. That being said, modernity and postmodernity are not without their failures, their wrong turns, excesses, and cul-de-sacs. If they weren't, there'd be no need to develop any further. The nature of growth, be it spiritual or cultural, is to take the good from what the world presents us and leave the bad. As the integralists say, transcend and include. Modernity fails, just like traditionalism, in taking the limited and the parochial for the absolute and universal. We needed the critique of the postmoderns to show that what moderns so often took to be objective and universal were actually prejudiced and privileged. Reason, it turned out, actually can't explain everything. In fact, cold logic can just as equally be applied to liberal emancipation as to perfecting the gas chambers. Knowledge is not the same as wisdom. The how simply doesn't answer the why, and the why is the heart of spirituality. Good material conditions do not fulfilled and happy people make. Man does not live on McDonald's and Netflix alone. And it turns out, the very mechanisms devoted to maximizing material comforts can actually create a world very uncomfortable for the human soul, very inhospitable to human flourishing. Science and analysis are powerful, but the limits of their application have been revealed all too starkly. It gives us the wonder material called plastic, but clogs the ocean with it. Gives us the miracle of the combustion engine, but disrupts the climate with it, provides us with steam engines and trains which roll their way to Auschwitz, to the iron cage. The postmoderns recognized all this, but they have proven blind and limited in their own way. In castigating science and rationalism for its failures, they made an absolute of relativity, contingency, context. Universals be damned. They were deemed too dangerous, too oppressive. As a result, any sense of the whole was exploded into fragments. There is no reality, only perspectives. There is no truth, only narratives of truth vying for power. There is no totality, only incommensurable language games. In short, there is only disillusionment. Endless critique, no constructive responses, endless takedowns, over-analysis, problematizing, laying bare, canceling. Good luck living in that. Man does not live on skepticism alone either. Humans need things they can affirm, values they can live by, models they can live up to. They need myths, however false, narratives, however potentially limiting, gods, however idolatrous. Even the silence of apophaticism can prove too little to worship or pray to. Our constraints are both our limits and the conditions by which we live. It is not enough to blindly accept them, nor is it enough to always be tearing them down. Indeed, what we seek is growth, development. Life is about illusions, disillusionment, and forging anew. Perhaps even, as Nietzsche appreciated, forging new and better illusions. Life is about construction, deconstruction, and then, as the metamodernists appreciate, reconstruction. Life is about the spiritual path, which is neither narrow certainty nor cynical nihilism, but evolution, adaptation, maturation, and a goal. So, where does all this leave us? The traditionalists say, reality is spiritual, life is meaningful, the world is enchanted and full of miracles. The moderns say, the spiritual is material, scriptures are not history. Trust experience, not authority. The universe is billions of years old, vast and complex beyond our reckoning. The postmoderns say, God is a social construct. Language is limited to express anything. Even experience has its blind spots. Everything you say is culturally situated and fails to express absolute truth. The metamoderns say, Amen. Amen. All of it is true. Reality is spiritual, life is meaningful, the world is enchanted and full of miracles. The spiritual is material, scriptures aren't history, trust experience, not authority, etc., etc. Amen. These ideas are inclusively reinforcing, not exclusively negating. Yes, each new cultural code shifts our understanding of the previous one in ways that make it no longer tenable in certain aspects. But when properly integrated, it does not simply annul the previous code. Rather, it complexifies, nuances, and deepens its core insights, while challenging, refining, and filtering its weaknesses. Modernity is not the end of spirituality, nor does postmodernity spell its radical undermining. Taking the best from both and eschewing the worst, human spirituality is changed, but strengthened. If we can embrace this idea and throw ourselves into exploring its implications, we will be in a position to take the next step in spirituality's development, fashioning a metamodern spirituality that can and must change the world for the better. What does that look like? Well, here's where the rubber meets the road. Here's where things get interesting. After so much deconstruction of traditional religion, we are finally in a place to start putting things back together. After deconstruction, say the metamodernists, comes reconstruction. And so a metamodern spirituality must indeed approach the task of reconstructing religion. It must build something new, and what it builds must be an efficacious, meaningful narrative to meet the urgent demands of the meaning crisis. What might this be? What if it is the co-creation of religion itself? What if people found purpose in the collective endeavor to better imagine spirituality for the world? To salvage God from tradition's limits and give expression to the sacred in new ways that work? What if the new mythology we need is a myth of God's coming into being, of God's becoming, God's metamorphosis, God's rebirth? For the old God is dead. But what new God is possible? What God is waiting to be born by us, through us, by means of us? A life spent in the service of rendering divinity into reality? What more purposeful task could one hope for? Such an idea may sound radical, and yet, it is precisely what the religious deconstructions of modernity and postmodernity have prepared us for. For modernity killed the old God of tradition, revealing the myriad ways that mythic naivete was inadequate and dysfunctional. But postmodernity likewise killed the idea that we could ever become masters of the universe, or have total knowledge of everything, and ever really grasp the absolute. Language is only a tool, and always an imperfect one, to approximate truth. Science, like myth, depends upon, well, poetry, upon metaphor, analogy, models, the imagination, utilitarian symbols that gesture towards truth without definitively ever reaching it. Whatever we're going to mean by words like God and sacred, then, will necessarily remain beyond the ability of words to grasp. Even the empirical realities beyond our sensory can, be they down quarks or black holes, must find expression through analogy, through metaphor. How much more so the mysteries, orders of magnitude beyond our capacities. Once disillusioned of the absolute reality of our symbols, we can appreciate them for the highly contingent, imperfect, and relative things they are. But rather than this leading us to despair of meaning, this frees us to meaning, to novel expressions of ultimate concerns, and taking symbol construction into our own hands and engaging mythic invention consciously. If the absolute remains beyond us, and if the God of language is a social construct, then any metaphor that evokes in people a sense of the sacred is useful, right, and real. It will never be correct, but it may be more correct, more helpful, more healthful, and more functional than prior attempts. After modernity, myth becomes pathological as history, but as metaphor, it can remain salutary. In this way, symbols from tradition can indeed still be spiritually efficacious in metamodernity, but only if they are seen in the metaphorical lens demanded of modernity and in the relative lens demanded by postmodernity. However, once myth is thus properly understood, which is to say, freed from the pretense of representing absolute ontological realities, then one is no longer chained to the myths of tradition, forced to accept or reject them in toto. Rather, if certain symbols are not efficacious and salutary, leave them behind. Take the gold from tradition and leave the dross. Play with tradition, bend it, break it, refashion it, reduce, reuse, recycle. Just don't treat it as the absolute, either of truth or of foolishness. Even bolder, invent your own. Myth, properly understood, remains an open genre, a living, present medium available for expressing the sacred as it is experienced now, today, in metamodernity. Yes, even by you. Those who would engage ultimate concerns through this medium and attempt to craft new narratives, new symbols, new metaphors for framing sacred experience are working at the very cusp of religious reconstruction. Likewise, those who would take inspiration from traditional religious praxis and shape new sacred spaces, formulate new rituals, foster new communities. The use of such genres, myth and ritual, is important, I think, and not purely accidental. Traditional religion succeeded admirably at telling meaningful stories that helped us orient ourselves and bind together in effective communities. Those stories spoke to the deepest yearnings and aspirations of the human psyche. Today, we refer to these as myths, and the grammar of myth remains one of the most powerful tools in the world. Myth is, you could say, a kind of psychotechnology, one that uses metaphorical language to shape narratives that speak to human beings in profoundly psychologically fulfilling ways. Now, modernity eschewed this technology for that of the discursive essay and procedural experiment, postmodernity for critical interrogation and deconstruction. All have their merits, but myth is still possible, indeed, urgently needed, provided it is properly approached. In some ways, one might imagine modernity as a moment when the meaning-making process of religion bifurcated into two different fields, science and poetry. Metamodern religious reconstruction would seek to reunite these again in meaningful ways, such that the narratives that orient us to reality are told once more in the language of the heart and of the psyche. Religious reconstruction done in this way, I believe, preserves that pure, immediate, inspirational, and motivational sense of meaning that humans once found through traditional mythology, without losing or otherwise abandoning the gains of critical reflective thought provided so well by modern and postmodern interrogation. Indeed, metamodern myths would be born out of modern and postmodern critique and reflection, but the form they would take would be akin to traditional mythology. Today, we need not only myth, but very specific myths. We need a myth that tells us the earth is sacred, and not something to be trashed. We need a myth that life is precious and meaningful. We need a myth that places the profound advances in cosmology, physics, and biology into a poetic and psychologically fulfilling narrative. We need metamodern myth makers, poets of the sacred. But, like poetry, the effort of such reconstructionists will necessarily be individual and decentralized. We don't need another capital C church propagating a new organizing dogma for everyone to adopt by coercion. What we need is organic creativity and highly personal expressions of the divine. The religion of tomorrow is not another closed canon, closed-minded set of beliefs either imposed, adopted, or rejected. The religion of tomorrow is open source, co-created, and personally developed. And as more and more creatives recognize the significance of such a task, more and more myths will spread among us, providing people material they can adopt or adapt as they see fit, as fits their psychic needs. In this religion of tomorrow, not everyone needs to be a creative myth maker per se. Just as in our current digital world, not everyone is necessarily creating memes or recording podcasts. Artists create for themselves, but also for the world. So too the mythopoets to come. What gets created can become a mythological commons, open to inspire meaning in others, and fair use for development and adaptation. For either by transformation, adaptation, invention, or propagation, we can all be co-creating the sacred. The world I noted above is in no way uniformly operating at one particular cultural code. Cultural and personal development is an uneven process, and society will continue to be widely populated by people using different epistemas, different stages, different affective value memes, etc. What if, I wonder, there were metamodern myths put into the world that could speak to people at all these stages? Myths that speak in the mythic traditional mode, through the mythic modality, and yet, because they stem ultimately from a metamodern cultural code, also operate effectively in a rationalized modern mode as well as a deconstructed postmodern mode. That is, what if we had polyvalent myths, trans-culturally coded myths? Myths that could reach and speak to millions of people regardless of stage or code. I see no reason why the myth of transforming God couldn't work in this way. When we speak of God, we are, perforce, speaking mythologically. The very word God carries with it millennia of connotation, association, and depth, an aura of awesomeness, a patina of profundity. What if our new mythology was itself rooted in the narrative of working with God to realize God's self in the world? To assist God in God's coming to be. Perhaps we see all religious traditions as participatory in this great endeavor. Perhaps this effort has been unfolding for millennia, as elements of God came online, now in Egypt, now in Mesopotamia, India, China, Palestine. Perhaps we stand at the edge of an unprecedented period to which these various developments have been leading. Our conscious awareness of God's transformation and humanity's role in the process. What has hitherto been unfolding haphazardly over the centuries can now become intentional, conscious, deliberate, as human beings turn to myth, to art, to poetry, to sculpt the latent God out of the rock of time, in order that God can become more what God has been becoming all this time. Such a project seems far more compelling than all this mindless getting and spending of late capitalism anyway. Such a goal seems more evocative than the paltry aspirations towards comfort and convenience which have stripped modern and postmodern humanity of its soul. Such an effort seems meaningful, I think, in the deepest imaginable way. And, if for some this meaning is engaged mythologically, for others it might be engaged more naturalistically, as the perennial effort to draw closer to ultimate reality and to a more just and beautiful society. The gods of human endeavor that we are always straining to approach, but never finally realizing. So where does all this leave us? As ever, in the present moment. One both pregnant with possibility as well as haunted by the specters of impending catastrophe. We live in a time between worlds, which means that the old world has passed away, or is passing away, but the new has not yet arrived. We have a sense of where we've been, but no certainty of where we're going. And as the chasm between past and future opens wider, more and more people are desperately scrambling for something to hold on to. Some clutch their fundamentalisms or absolutist ideologies, while others freefall into nihilism, apathy, or despair. None of this helps. What we need is genuine, efficacious meaning, up to date with reality, functional, aspirational, bottom-up, and broadly applicable. To get there will require some hard personal and cultural development, which means some difficult disillusionment. But if disillusionment can be understood constructively, not as the loss of myth and meaning, but as their clarification, refinement, improvement, perhaps we can make the desperately needed update to religion our precarious moment demands of us. Perhaps the myths and meaning we find on the other side will bring just the sort of clarity and commitment needed to tend to the myriad problems besetting us. Perhaps constructively co-creating the future together isn't so different from co-creating God. Well, that's something to believe in anyway. So let's get to making. Peace.